a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. Today, we are joined by Portland City Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, University of Minnesota Student Body President Emeritus Jael Kurandi to talk about their successful efforts to get police out of schools. So months of protest against police-involved killings of Black Americans, including George Floyd and too many others, have led to calls for defunding police and investing resources in education, housing, and our communities. In a historic vote, Portland School Board voted against renewing an agreement with Portland Police to have continuous police presence in schools. Portland Superintendent Guadalupe Guerrera said that they would spend additional money on social workers, counselors, and targeted support for students. Now, the school did not pay for the police presence. That money came from the city council, but it all comes from the local city budget, which is forced to pay for more police instead of student investments. Now, our guest, Commissioner Hardesty, has suggested that the $1.6 million spent on school police should be defunded, along with the police department's violent reduction team and transit police. Similarly, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, weeks of protests finally led to multiple organizations, including the University of Minnesota, Minnesota Parks, and others, terminating their relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. Now, that groundswell culminated in Minneapolis City Council's decision to disband the Minneapolis Police Department. Today, our guests will talk about what has happened in their respective cities and what's going to come next. Now, turning first to you, Commissioner. Nationwide studies suggest that school arrests sharply increase after police are placed in schools. So can you tell us what has happened in your community after police were placed in your local schools?
Absolutely. We were sold that schools would be safer if we had police officers right in the building. We were sold that police officers who work with students were trained differently than police officers that just patrolled the street. But I have spent well over a decade talking to students who don't feel safer with armed people in their schools. And the students even acknowledge the difference between how Black students are treated and other students are treated in the school. Ironically, the day I was sworn in, January 1st of 2019, there was a protest happening outside to get rid of school resource officers. And it was hysterical because young people knew the first African-American woman being elected, and they protested at the exact same time I was being sworn in. I told those young people if I was not being sworn in, I would have been out on the protest line with them. And so, because in Portland, there were not a lot of arrests by school resource officers, what we were being told was, well, we're not really there to arrest kids. But Portland Police had a gang enforcement unit that 54% of the people they stopped, searched, and questioned were African American. I live in a city with a 6% African American population. And so for well over a decade, I kept asking, how is that even possible? That this gang enforcement unit, 54% of their stops are of Black people. It just doesn't make sense. And before I was on the city council, no one would answer my question. They would thank me politely for my testimony. They would tell me they would get back to me with information. But the moment I was elected, all of a sudden the gang enforcement team was renamed to the Gun Violence Reduction Team. But guess what? The same officers were targeting the same people with the same effort. And so I knew that the school resource officers were using our kids to get information about their parents, their neighborhood, what's going on, who's involved in activities, and they were feeding that information to the gang violence reduction, to the gang enforcement unit, right? Because there's no way that 54% of the stops would be made of Black people if in fact there's no other avenue for them to get data. And that's what they do to our kids. They pump them for information and then use it to terrorize people in our community.
Thank you, Commissioner. And just going off of your comment, just thinking about putting police in schools and giving them another name, I think it's important to note that there's research from the ACLU that suggests that evidence-based resources, programs, and targeted investments in students is better than having police in schools. And
Yes.
so, what programs are you hoping to see will receive more funding that can truly help students, help them cope with stress, and really help them succeed at school?
Well, I was thrilled when Portland school superintendent said they were going to invest in counselors because most schools don't have counselors, right? And it's like crazy. Why would we invest in police and not invest in counselors? Now, in Oregon, schools are funded by the state legislature, so we don't provide at the city direct financing to the public school systems. We have 6 public schools within the city of Portland, and so we don't actually provide direct funding. But I can tell you, as we reduce police and create more community resources to help people, we will see much better outcomes for our young people in schools. When they know they're not being targeted, when they know that they don't have to worry about interacting with a police officer because they're supposed to be officer friendly, it will have a huge impact on our students' ability to learn when they get in school. And let me just say, I am a strong advocate. We just last year, a year ago, invested in Black student success very specifically. And so there's $1 billion going into our school system that is to help us with the graduation rate for Black students.
Thank you, Commissioner. And better outcomes for students, that's everyone's goal. Now, moving back to your legacy, we know that you've been pushing for reform to policing for decades. Now, what did it take to get the city of Portland to finally agree to remove police from schools? Can you tell us about that journey?
Let me tell you that in my 19 months on the Portland City Council, I have put in proposals to remove the school resource officers 3 times. My very first budget, I suggested that maybe we should take this money out of the police budget and invest it in parks because we were about to cut significant staffing from parks because of a budget deficit. I thought investing in parks is a much more beneficial thing. And so that was my very first budget cycle. I could not get my colleagues to support it. So 3 times I put in a request to remove the school resource officers, the transit police, and the gun violence reduction team. What it took was young people taking to the street every single night. And right now we're in day 48 of protests in the city of Portland. What it took was people taking to the street every night, 70,000 emails plus. I stopped counting at 70,000. 700 people signing up to testify about defunding the police. That's what it took for me to do something I've been trying to do for 30 years, right? So people think this is like this came out of nowhere, but the reality is that these proposals have been on the table for a long, long, long time. And our elected leaders have never listened to the community's voice. But let me be clear, 70,000 emails I haven't gotten for every other issue I have been involved with at the city council in 19 months, right? It didn't total 70,000 of everything. So to get 70,000 emails on one topic, defunding the police, was significant. And I do believe that that outside pressure is what made my colleagues understand that they had to do something. They had to do something significant, right? And so we cut $27 million out of the police budget this year. And the police are mad, let me just say, right? And they're going to be madder, but because we have more reform to come.
Thank you, Commissioner. So this was a real community effort.
Yes,
So
yeah.
turning,
I couldn't have done it if the community had not been demanding I mean, demanding change, right? And what they were saying is just do what Minneapolis did, right? Just do away with your police department. So I can't wait to hear how it's going in Minneapolis with that proposal. But for me, I am taking a very thoughtful approach, right? Yes, we've cut some money, but we also have to be able to tell the public what's our vision, right? And I have a vision for community safety that means that there will be a lot less armed people on our street, right? Our vision is that what we need to do is have people with medical backgrounds. I've talked to you before about the Portland Street Response, which I had a pilot that would have had one location that would match an EMT with a mental health professional, a qualified mental health professional, to respond to calls that did not include weapons and violence, right? What we know with our 911 system is the bulk of the calls we get nowadays are calls for unwanted people because people are houseless, people are camping out outside of businesses, and that's what police are responding to. Police have no tools in their toolbox to respond to people who are houseless, right? Other than the tools they always use, yelling at people, demanding they move, et cetera, right? So and because of the cut in the police budget, I now have 6 pilots that will be rolling out through the city of Portland. And that's one piece. I think once the community sees that we can have first responders that respond with compassionate and empathy and help, rather than dictating behavior and mandating people move. When you are houseless in a community where if you don't make $24 an hour, you can't afford a 1 bedroom in the city of Portland, to target people because they are houseless and poor is just criminal, right? And so what I see is that's really shifting. The role of police should be simply to solve crime and prevent crime. They're not housing experts. They're not mental health experts. They don't have any secret resources that they can put people into housing and help people get education. So let's stop using police as if their role is to fix society problems. Their role is to solve crime, and that's all they should do. So my vision of police is that we're going to need a lot less of them, and they will only focus on solving crime and preventing crime.
Thank you, Commissioner. And it sounds like many people in the community share that vision as well. I mean, at
Yeah.
least 70,000. And you
But let me
really
just
bring,
say that they weren't happy with me because people wanted us to cut $50 million out of the budget. And for me, because I know that you can't just take a number and then just take it out of the budget without a plan, I think that we're taking a very thoughtful approach and we're moving quickly. But the community, the 700 people who testified, all had the same message: cut the budget by 50%, $50 million, and keep cutting it until it's at zero, right? I didn't do that. I don't believe that we will have a society without police, but I think we have to drastically narrow the role that police play and actually being first responders.
thank you, Commissioner. So let's bring in Jael to this conversation. So Jael, you were instrumental in changing the relationship between the University of Minnesota and the Minneapolis Police Department. And we know the Commissioner has talked about what's been going on in Minnesota. So you helped convince the university to end its contract with the Minneapolis Police. And that decision was critical in helping to galvanize momentum across Minneapolis to disassociate with police, culminating in Minneapolis City Council deciding to disband the Minneapolis Police Department. So, Jael, what was your experience as a student that helped convince you to support and work for these changes?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. A lot of this came from, I think, as the commissioner mentioned, this isn't something that started today. This isn't something that started in 2020, but people have been working on this for years. And I think it's very important to honor the work that has gone into this year after year and the research and the education that exists out there about this topic. But in regards to specifically my experience at the University of Minnesota, I think I'm a Black woman who has Black friends and has Black male friends and has a father and has a mother and sisters and brothers that I continuously see. And I think what people are forgetting is we saw Trayvon Martin, right? We saw that happen when we were so much younger. And now we're starting to grow up and we're seeing repeat offenses, right? You're seeing this happen over and over again. And it comes to say, like, what do we do now? right? Like then you almost feel to some extent, not necessarily powerless, but you question what is my role in this? And now you come to a position which I can speak out. And just as the commission mentioned, like the youth have taken to the streets and have gone and protested and done this. But specifically at the University of Minnesota, I attended an event in the spring of 2018 where we saw a lot of police force, a lot of aggression. And I was wrapping up my first year on campus at that time, and I was waiting for the university response. I was like, there's no way our university is not going to speak up about this situation. I was there, I witnessed it, and I kept hearing these stories back and forth about, well, we think this happened, we think this happened. And we never saw this statement come from the university, even recognizing the trauma that it caused for so many people that were there, especially because this was a family-friendly event. So we had people coming out from external of our university and really making sure that people were there and were listening. So it was a very interesting place to be at that time. And after that, I kept asking our university, what are we going to do about the relationship between the police and our students? What are we going to do about these things that are going on? And I still was hearing very redundant, very continuous conversations of, well, maybe we should do this, or maybe we should have this. And in the letter that I wrote to the university on that Tuesday evening said, I'm done having these conversations and I'm done with these donut hours, because one of the community engagement was like bringing donut hours or bringing donuts into academic buildings and trying to engage with students there. And that's not how you go into communities. That's not how you come in. That is not an invitation. That is not welcoming. And so in that regard, I was so frustrated that our university was still going to see these things. And we were still having these conversations. And I had asked, what are we going to do about this? And that's in a point to which I think I was very open to conversation. I was very ready to meet people in the middle and let's find a middle ground and have this discussion. Now, when the murder of George Floyd happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota could never claim Minnesota nice, right? We couldn't say, well, this is happening somewhere else. Or we couldn't be like, oh, well, that's a problem for another place, another time. We are not really dealing with that here. And even looking at the trend of the Minneapolis Police Department, it's not like it wasn't happening here, is that people weren't acknowledging that it was happening here. So in that regard, I was very adamant that if this is going to happen 15 to 20 minutes from our campus, we have to say something and need to say something now. We're not going to wait for things to quote unquote calm down. We aren't going to be patient with maybe the public response. We aren't going to seek some sort of medium that is happy for everyone, because Black lives are being murdered. It is no longer a happy medium for everyone. It's a nonpartisan issue to me. It should be a nonpartisan issue to everyone. And, we look at those 3 liberties that were promised to us of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Angela Rice said something. She said, we're still stuck at life. We are still stuck at life. And that to me, as somebody who's in a position as a student body president, I couldn't let that opportunity pass without saying something.
Thank you, Jael. So going back to the event that you referenced where you first started thinking about police in school and that school presence, was there police violence at that event?
So I did not specifically experience police violence. There's different accounts of what went on, but there was definitely aggression. I was spoken to by the police, the way they were speaking to other students was very inappropriate. And again, this is an event that there was no necessity to bring police in, especially in this police from different departments from around the state. At one point, I remember there was a helicopter there. And as you can imagine, students are literally just going home, right? On student grounds or on university property that they pay for, right? Let's not forget that students are paying tuition dollars into these institutions and are paying these police officers. For them to see this retaliation, it's so inhumane.
Thank you. And you mentioned conversations. So can you tell us about the conversations that you have been having or had to have with the university administration and how they evolved over the course of this kind of timeline and how you got to the point to where you are now?
Yeah, I think the initial conversations we were having back after that event happened was my question to the university of what are we going to do, right? What are you going to do, because you have chosen to be in this position of power and serve students? And I would hope that would be everybody's mission if they're going to choose to be in higher ed. So if that is your mission and goal, what are you going to do about this event? The Somali Student Association put out their own statement, which I cited in my letter, and where they detailed the event. So I was like, what how can you stand by and let this happen and not even recognize its occurrence? And yes, of course, there's probably conversations that happened on the back end, or maybe something was said to the specific group, but there's no public response to show where the university stood. And so in light of events that have happened, and specifically with the murder of George Floyd, I think there's finally people that are willing to say things like race and Black people and racism, and talk about microaggressions, and talk about white privilege, and talk about these institutions that are inherently racist, and talk about how they are continuously been harming Black people over and over and over. And I think people are getting beyond just overt racism, right, which is what people like to point to, but the fact that we have redlining, and how does that affect how we recruit students of color, and talking about how our healthcare system has disproportionately affected Black students and Black people, and what that does for a student who might be in school at the same time. I think people are finally willing and ready to realize that how the higher education is set up and how education is set up is Black students were never meant to succeed, right? They were never set up in a way that their pathway to college seemed seamless, or that effort was all we could base them on. A lot of people talk about, like, you work hard and your output should be X. Well, Black students were never set up, right? Our output could never be X. And so I think people are finally willing to realize this. And of course, there's people that aren't. There's people that don't want to acknowledge it. There's people that want to avoid the conversation. But I think we're finally starting to see people see that racism never went away, it just changed forms. And people are so, I think, to get called a racist, and passive racism is so real, and so many people are passive racist. And I think people are starting to realize, I've been a passive racist for so long, thinking that, you know, racism went away, but now it has just evolved into a different form.
Thank you, Jael. And it really sounds like the door is open, not just to having these honest conversations, but action and a real introspection to the experience of African-American students who are at predominantly white institutions. Now, moving forward to your vision, what is your vision as student body president? What is your vision for student safety at the University of Minnesota? And what should the university be spending its money on instead of police?
Yes, that's a great question. And I actually just wrapped up my term, but I will still be working with our university as a student leader. And I think that in regards to what we hope to see from our university, one, I thoroughly believe we have to hire more faculty of color that are going to be on tenure track. And I say that very specifically because I think in the way higher education works, if you're not on tenure track, there tends to be different nuances that exist for you. And I think they have to work less on just recruiting, but also retaining these faculty of color. The second thing I want to see, like the commissioner mentioned, is those mental health resources, and having mental health counselors and professionals who are of color, who are Black, right? And being ready to say that this is what we need for our students. And yes, they are only 6.3% of our student population, and we are still going to invest in a resource for them. I think we often go back in higher ed and we like to go back to the numbers and say, well, we don't have majority of students that need this. That's not the case, and it cannot be the case, because we're here to serve students. Those 6.3% are still paying tuition. I promise you they're still paying tuition. So they should be receiving the same return on their investment. And lastly, we have to reimagine safety. The safety of the objective, is there a fence here? Do I feel safe? I don't think is often what we're talking about, and often the thing that people refer to, right? I have a gun, therefore I feel safe. That's not the case. Safety has a lot more to do with trust. It has a lot more to do with the mental. And the trend that we have seen throughout our lives as young people who are now in college and those that are coming in is one of trauma. It is the visions and the media that we are seeing today of the police. Therefore, even the young students from elementary school right now are not going to trust the police because of these images, because of the return and the repeat offense that we are seeing and its frequency. So we have to be able to imagine safety in a way that actually causes the public and Black students and Black people to trust the people that are supposed to keep them safe, rather than feel like they have to be protected from them.
Thank you so much. And trust and safety is so key. So bringing both of my panelists back into our discussion, I'm going to pose a few questions, and I would just love to hear both of your responses. Okay. So first question, and both of you have touched upon this, that school police can cause and worsen racial trauma. Yes. And the schools that see police presence are usually not the schools that the rich kids attend. That's According right. to studies, school police duties vary widely, but consistently result in more disciplinary incidents reported to law enforcement. Right. And as reported by the US Department of Education, Black students are more than twice as likely to be arrested as white students, even though Black students do not misbehave more than white students. So, how have you both seen these disparities play out in Portland and in Minneapolis? And so, Commissioner, can we start with you?
Sure. I so appreciate my co-panelist what she said because uh, what we have not acknowledged is that white supremacy is alive and well in every institution that we have in the United States, and anti-blackness has been accepted as the norm. And so when you look at data that's been collected over decades that haven't, the needle hasn't moved at all. And what you know in Oregon is Native Americans are at the bottom of every social determinant of health, and African Americans are right on top of them. And so in a city that touts itself as being progressive, those numbers haven't moved at all, right? And 30 years of record keeping. So you have to ask yourself, if white kids graduated at the same rate as black kids did in Portland, there would be white parents all over the street. They would be demanding heads. They would be just yelling, jumping up and down, right? But somehow we've accepted that black kids have such a low graduation rate that that's just the norm. We've accepted that 54% of black people can be stopped and accused of being gang members because that's just the norm, right? And until we have more people that are black in public office who come from the community and are grounded in community, we will continue to have these outcomes, right? So, in my mind, police should have never been in schools at all, right? We should have never thought that that would be a way to keep young people safe. Health clinics in school keep young people safe. Mental health workers in school keep young people safe. Clubs in school that allow young people's voice to actually influence policy, that keeps young people safe, right? We know what works, but it's a shortcut when we think that police are going to solve the problem. Police have never been problem solvers for black and brown communities. And quite frankly, I don't see a world where police will be the ones that will fundamentally solve a community crisis, right? They have a very limited job, and we've just allowed them to expand it way beyond where it should have been.
Thank you. Jael, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think personally, like the commissioner just mentioned, I wish that we didn't even have to get this to higher ed institutions. I wish this was in K through 12. I wish in K through 5 they were taught better coping mechanisms if they're feeling frustrated in class. I wish a teacher took the time to show them the investment and interest in their personal learning growth journey before they got to a point in which it was just like, oh, and I'm going to send you out of class, right? You're somebody else's problem. Like, I can't deal with you and you're somebody else's problem, where their white peer might be sitting there and it's, let me talk to you through this. So I think those different ways in which teachers, especially in K through 12, are taught to work with children should be consistent, right? If you're going to give treatment to a certain student, it should be the same for the other student. The assumptions and the microaggressions that teachers are making of students in K through 12 is what carries on, right? They go on and they think this, and then they get to middle school and they think they're better than their black classmate. And then they get to high school and it's normative to have this anti-blackness, like the commission mentioned. And then these are the people that go to college, be educated, and then lead our institutions, which is why representation matters. I remember coming into my role and somebody said, why does it matter that you're the first black president? Why does that matter? But this is why it matters, right? This right here, this moment in history and what is going on, this is why representation matters, because we can speak on these experiences. We can advocate for our people in this way. Not to say I speak on behalf of the race, but I can advocate for our race and what has gone on. And so I think it's very important to see that we elevate these black voices and what they are needing in schools, because the school to prison pipeline is real, right? You can go back, there's education, there's literature out there that it is real. And I think people have to, if you're going to be an educator, if that is truly your wish to educate, you have to be anti-racist in the work you do. And if you are not, then you should be also questioning your ethic and moral behind being in education.
Thank you, Jael, and thank you, Commissioner. So at this time, I would just like to thank both of my panelists, Commissioner Joanne Hardesty and Jael Karandi, for your wonderful words, for allowing us to have this really insightful conversation, really not just about getting police out of schools, but the underpinning of racial injustice that is tied to having police presence in our schools. So thank you for our viewers for joining us today as well. We will be live again tomorrow, Tuesday, at 4 p.m. Eastern with Senator Elizabeth Warren and Carol Fife of Moms for Housing to talk about housing justice and race. So we hope to see you all